Africa is often described as the poorest continent on Earth. Many of the countries with the lowest incomes in the world are located there, and millions of people still struggle with poverty and limited economic opportunities. In several regions, a large part of the population lives on only a few dollars a day, and access to basic services such as healthcare, electricity, and education remains limited. Because of these realities, Africa is frequently associated with economic hardship. However, this picture tells only part of the story. What makes Africa's situation especially puzzling is the fact that the continent itself is incredibly rich in natural resources. Africa holds some of the largest reserves of valuable minerals and energy resources on the planet. It is estimated that around 30% of the world's mineral resources are located on the African continent. These include enormous deposits of gold, diamonds, cobalt, uranium, platinum, and many other valuable materials that are essential for modern industries. Some of the world's most important mining regions are found there. South Africa, for example, has long been one of the largest producers of gold and platinum. The Democratic Republic of Congo contains the majority of the world's cobalt, a critical metal used in batteries and modern electronics. Nigeria possesses vast reserves of oil, making it one of the largest oil producers in Africa. In addition to minerals and oil, Africa also has enormous agricultural potential. The continent contains vast areas of fertile land capable of producing food for both domestic consumption and global markets. Large river systems such as the Nile, Congo, and Niger provide water resources that support agriculture and human settlements. Africa is also home to a rapidly growing population and a large supply of young workers who could potentially contribute to economic development in the future. Despite these advantages, the economic outcomes across much of the continent remain far below what might be expected from such resource wealth. Many African economies rely heavily on exporting raw materials rather than producing finished goods. Countries rich in oil or minerals often depend on a small number of industries for most of their national income. When global prices for these resources rise, the economy may grow quickly. But when prices fall, economic growth can slow dramatically. This dependence on natural resources creates an unusual contradiction. On one hand, Africa possesses enormous wealth beneath its soil. On the other hand, large parts of the population do not experience the benefits of that wealth in their daily lives. Roads, industrial infrastructure, and advanced manufacturing sectors remain underdeveloped in many regions. As a result, much of the value generated from natural resources does not translate into broad economic prosperity. The contrast between Africa's natural wealth and its economic challenges raises an important question. If the continent possesses so many valuable resources, why has economic development been so difficult for many of its countries? The answer cannot be explained by natural resources alone. To understand the deeper reasons behind Africa's economic struggles, it is necessary to look beyond the resources themselves and examine the historical forces that shape the continent's economic systems. To understand why many African countries struggle economically despite their natural wealth, it is necessary to look at the historical forces that shape the continent. One of the most important turning points in Africa's modern history occurred during the late 19th century, when European powers began dividing the continent among themselves. This process reached its peak during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where several European countries met to formalize the rules for colonizing African territories. During this conference, European empires such as Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal claimed large parts of the continent. Borders were drawn across maps with little consideration for the complex social and ethnic realities of the region. Different ethnic groups, languages, and cultures were often forced into the same political boundaries, while other groups were divided between multiple colonies. These artificial borders later became the borders of modern African states, creating long-term political and social tensions that would remain even after independence. Colonial rule also shaped the economic structure of many African territories. European colonial administrations did not build diversified economies designed to support local development. Instead, their main objective was to extract valuable resources and transport them to European markets. Infrastructure such as railways, roads, and ports was often built primarily to move raw materials like minerals, rubber, and agricultural products from inland regions to coastal ports for export. Because of this economic model, colonial economies focused heavily on the production of a few specific resources. Some regions specialized in mining valuable minerals, while others focused on crops such as cocoa, coffee, or cotton. However, little effort was made to develop local manufacturing industries that could process these resources domestically. The majority of raw materials were exported in their basic form, while finished goods were imported from Europe. This structure created economies that were highly dependent on external markets. When global demand for certain resources was strong, colonial economies could generate significant revenue. But when prices dropped, economic activity would quickly decline. Local populations had very limited control over these economic systems, and much of the wealth generated from African resources flowed outward rather than being reinvested within the continent. By the middle of the 20th century, many African countries began gaining independence from colonial rule. The period between the 1950s and the 1970s saw dozens of new nations emerge across the continent. Political independence brought hope for economic transformation and national development. However, the newly independent states inherited economic systems that were largely built around exporting raw materials rather than developing diversified industries. These newly formed governments faced the difficult task of managing countries with limited infrastructure, economies dependent on a few export products, and borders that often contained deep ethnic and political divisions. While independence gave African nations control over their own governments, the structural economic patterns created during the colonial period continued to influence their development for decades afterward. After gaining independence, many African countries faced the challenge of managing economies that were heavily dependent on natural resources. Oil, minerals, and other valuable commodities became the primary sources of national income for several states. At first, these resources appeared to offer a clear path to economic growth. Governments expected that exporting oil, gold, diamonds, and other minerals would generate enough revenue to build infrastructure, expand education, and develop modern industries. However, in many cases, the presence of valuable resources created a different set of problems that slowed long-term economic development. Economists often describe this phenomenon as the resource curse. The resource curse refers to a situation in which countries that possess large reserves of natural resources sometimes experience slower economic growth than countries with fewer resources. Instead of strengthening the economy, heavy dependence on a small number of commodities can create instability and political competition for control over those resources. When national wealth is concentrated in industries such as oil or mining, governments may rely heavily on resource exports rather than building diversified economies. One of the major challenges linked to the resource curse is corruption. When large amounts of money flow into a country from natural resource exports, control over that revenue becomes extremely valuable. In some cases, political leaders and powerful elites compete to control resource income rather than investing it in long-term development. Funds that could be used to improve infrastructure, healthcare, and education may instead be mismanaged or diverted away from public investment. Over time, this weakens institutions and reduces trust in government systems. Resource wealth has also contributed to political conflicts in certain regions. Valuable commodities such as diamonds, oil, or minerals can become sources of competition between different political groups or armed movements. In some cases, control over resource-rich areas has fueled internal conflicts that damage infrastructure and disrupt economic activity. When instability spreads, investors become reluctant to commit capital, businesses struggle to operate, and economic growth slows further. At the same time, heavy reliance on exporting raw materials can limit the development of other sectors of the economy. If a country earns most of its income from a single industry such as oil or mining, there may be less incentive to develop manufacturing or advanced services. Skilled labor, government attention, and investment often concentrate around the resource sector. As a result, industries that could diversify the economy remain underdeveloped. This pattern can also make economies highly vulnerable to global price changes. Commodity prices on international markets often fluctuate significantly over time. When prices for oil, metals, or agricultural products rise, exporting countries may experience rapid economic growth and higher government revenues. But when those prices fall, national income can drop quickly. Countries that depend heavily on a small number of exports often struggle to maintain stable growth during these fluctuations. In many African economies, these challenges combine to slow the development of diversified economic systems. While natural resources provided large amounts of potential wealth, the combination of corruption, political competition for resources, and dependence on commodity exports created obstacles to sustainable growth. These structural challenges made it difficult for many countries to transform resource wealth into broad economic prosperity for their populations. Another major factor shaping Africa's economic future is its rapidly growing population. The continent currently has one of the fastest population growth rates in the world. In many African countries, birth rates remain significantly higher than in most other regions. As a result, the population of Africa has been increasing at a remarkable pace, and demographic projections suggest that this trend will continue throughout the coming decades. According to several global forecasts, the population of the continent could double by around the middle of the 21st century. This rapid demographic expansion creates both opportunities and challenges for economic development. A growing population means that millions of young people are entering the workforce each year. Africa is often described as the youngest continent in the world, with a large share of its population under the age of 25. In theory, this youthful demographic structure could become a powerful engine for economic growth. If enough jobs are created and education systems continue to expand, a large working-age population could increase productivity and stimulate economic activity across many industries. However, rapid population growth also places significant pressure on existing economic systems. Governments must provide education, healthcare, housing, and infrastructure for a constantly increasing number of people. In many countries, the pace of economic development has not always kept up with the speed of demographic growth. When the number of available jobs grows more slowly than the labor force, unemployment and underemployment can become widespread challenges, especially among young people. Urban areas across the continent have been expanding rapidly as people move from rural regions to cities in search of better opportunities. Large cities such as Lagos, Nairobi, and Kinshasa have experienced dramatic population growth over the past few decades. While urbanization can create economic opportunities, it can also strain housing markets, transportation systems, and public services if infrastructure development does not keep pace with population increases. Despite these challenges, Africa's demographic trends also create long-term potential. A young and expanding population can support economic growth if investments in education, technology, and infrastructure continue to increase. Many African economies have begun exploring new industries such as technology services, renewable energy, and regional trade networks. Improvements in connectivity, financial services, and digital infrastructure have already started transforming some sectors of the economy. The future of the continent will depend largely on how effectively governments and institutions manage these opportunities and challenges. If economic policies encourage investment, support entrepreneurship, and expand access to education and infrastructure, Africa's growing population could become a major driver of development. In that scenario, the same continent that has long been associated with economic struggle could gradually transform into one of the most dynamic economic regions in the world.